Electric Cafe.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Electric Cafe. Today's album review is on Synergy, his fourth album from 1979 called Games. This is the second time Synergy's been on my channel. I did review his third album called Chords from 1978 in a previous video just a couple months ago. So what we'll do in this video is talk a little bit about my history with Synergy and Larry Fast music. We'll go into this album called Games and talk a little bit about some of the tracks, and then I'll get my overall thoughts on the album, and then we'll play the album in its entirety and you'll see my scores on the individual tracks and my overall score on the album. And then I definitely encourage you to also play along and give the tracks your score and the album overall score and compare notes. And I would be curious to know your opinions of Synergy and the album called Games. If there's a song or an album that you'd like me to review in a future video, my email is down below. You can definitely make a request. So back in the 80s and 90s, I was always on the lookout when I was in record stores for interesting artwork. Something that caught my eye, something very unusual, and I always really liked taking chances on stuff where the artwork was sort of, right up my alley, and certainly, if things have like spacey artwork on it or unique artwork or, just catches your eye, I always want to take a chance on that music. And in the 80s and 90s, before the internet, that was like one of the main ways to expand your taste and finding different music was to try stuff based on the artwork. And there was a lot of other ways that you could do that as well, kind of expand your taste, whether liner notes, you knew somebody that was on the album, or you knew the producer, or somebody who remixed it, or you knew what label it was on. But artwork was sort of the first thing that sort of caught your eye, and you picked it up and then you looked more in depth and got a chance to read it and see what it was about. And my mind would just go crazy and my imagination would just run wild and sort of hope or think about what could possibly be on this music, and sort of I would have like an idea and then go home and play it and see if it actually exceeded those expectations, or maybe it didn't, or maybe it was right on point. But for the most part, I always felt like I was right on point for what I not necessarily expected, but I kind of hoped like it would sort of be in that sort of sound. And electronic music was a little bit easier for that because it always had like edgy artwork, and it didn't have the artist's picture on the cover, and it didn't have, it just looked more futuristic and more artistic, and maybe it had architecture in there, and it was maybe designed different, and the colors were different. It just looked like the future. Like electronic music always represented the future, and a lot of times their artwork would support that. And the first time I got a chance to hear Synergy's music, or at least find it, was back in the middle 80s when I first picked up his CD called Metropolitan Suite, which came out in 1986. I probably got it somewhere around like 1988. And I always had a soft spot for Larry Fast and Synergy's music because it was one of my first discoveries into new age music or synthesizer music. I was already sort of getting into Tangerine Dream in the middle 80s, but it was sort of hard to find certainly vinyl at the time, like Tangerine Dream in the middle 80s, like in used record stores. A lot of people that have certain artists, like you don't see The Cure in used record stores a lot, or Tangerine Dream. It's just because a lot of those people really value those records and they hold on to them because they're very special. There's certain bands that sort of become the cult status where sometimes it's just really hard to find some of their used albums in the record stores. So a lot of times, I wouldn't necessarily get lucky finding good new age music because those would always be kept, or even ambient music. Then I sort of got into some prog rock, and I would hear different things in Genesis and, through the 80s and early 90s. And, Larry Fast and Synergy was always something that I really, really liked. And if you get really into like electronic music like I did, like you tend to want to discover and sort of track the history of music and electronic music and how it evolved and the early sounds of it, and sort of that ties into certain keyboards and synthesizers and the evolution of everything from theremins all the way to early analog synthesizers, to tape machines, to digital, synthesizers, sequencers, beat machines. So you kind of you kind of gauge that history. And for me, as much as I like to find interesting music, I always wanted to find interesting sounds. And if you get really into electronic music, you want to discover and sort of track the history of those sounds. And, you go back to Switched on Bach in the late 80s, or Silver Apples, or, just the history of electronic sounds, like from the late 60s, especially into the early 70s, and then progressive rock, and then the ambient sort of started. And I always really enjoyed kind of understanding that history. And, Synergy was a good example that kind of got me into that sound. And so I've always had a soft spot for Synergy's music. The other thing that's interesting about tracking the history of sounds and bands, and just the history of electronic music, you find that electronic music is used in a lot of different genres. And so you kind of run into that as you sort of explore electronic music. And sure enough, as I went towards the 70s into ambient music, you got into, you would find it in experimental music. You would find it into prog rock. You would find it into krautrock. You would, even go into jazz fusion and hear it a little bit in there. Of course, disco, soundtrack music, but also, again, experimental music. So you kind of, along the way, you sort of find the avenue or how much you like of each one. Like, I wouldn't say I'm a huge progressive rock fan or a huge jazz fusion fan, but, there are albums in there that I like. And so, or maybe even, organ music or chamber music, stuff like that, like Keith Jarrett and stuff like that. So you or even minimalism, in there, like Steve Reich or Philip Glass or something like that. So you kind of find your way along, and you take pieces of what you like, but you're still into electronic music. But it's important to know those contributions along the way, I feel like, to get an understanding of the history of electronic music, so you can really appreciate the differences of, and the I wouldn't even say the differences, but the evolution of analog music, analog electronic music, and digital electronic music. So it helps you find a good foundation. At least that's what happened for me. So I felt like exploring those sounds. Not only did I find a lot of great music, but then you kind of understand the evolution of the sounds. And so you have a good understanding and a good experience or background of analog sounds and digital sounds, and how they sort of incorporated into different genres, whether that be rock or jazz or soundtrack music or even field recordings, stuff like that. So I've always been really into the history of tracking electronic music. And the good thing about that is it takes you into other genres, and so you can sort of explore those genres and see how much you want to go into prog rock, or see how much you want to go into new wave, or and that was kind of, that was, in retrospect, because I was really into sci-fi in the early 80s when I was a kid, everything from Star Wars to Buck Rogers to Battlestar Galactica to I have the soundtrack up there to Black Hole, and of course I have Tron here. So when you hear, I don't know, for me, when I was growing up and through those sounds and all those interesting music and soundtrack, and just odd kind of sci-fi sounds, you just kind of want to find that in the music. And of course that kind of led to getting into ambient music and even keyboard music with new wave and stuff like that. Was kind of the origin of what I liked and what led me towards getting into electronic music. So when I discovered and when I went through a lot of the 70s music, it was almost like going back through my original sounds, that of what directed me towards electronic music, even though I didn't really know it. Being 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, you kind of hear music that's on soundtracks and on even when I was on Disneyland, when I went to Disneyland, if you guys remember when Tron was on there with the People Mover, you'd hear the background music and hear all these sci-fi, and there was a lot of rides on Disneyland rides that would have like background music, and so you kind of come across that music, and it's just kind of the background music at the time. But then you kind of look back the next couple of years, and you're like, oh, I was really into sci-fi music. I really liked that kind of soundtrack music, and that's what really led me towards everything from techno to industrial music to ritual music to ambient music, and going forward. So I really always have really appreciated this foundation of music like Synergy's. So back in 1974, 1975, Synergy was signed to Passport Records, and Passport Records was known as a progressive rock label for the most part. They had Nectar and the bands called Brand X and Camel, and of course Anthony Phillips, who was the guitarist in early Genesis. Also Peter Hamill, who was in Vandergraaf Generator. So the label was pretty well known as a progressive rock label. I think they started maybe around 69 or 1970, somewhere around there. So they already had a pretty good track record by the time they signed Synergy. And, Synergy would end up doing, I think, roughly 7 or 8 albums all the way from 1975 to about 1981 through. And so Games was the 4th album from Synergy, 1979. And one of the things I really like about this particular album is it blending experimental and sort of the direction that he would eventually go into writing music for soundtracks and TV and things like that. And so Games has the nice balance of still being a little bit experimental, but going a little bit towards his range of, or the direction that he would end up going with, like doing soundtrack music and things like that. But it also balanced analog synthesizers and sort of the genesis of early digital synthesizers on this album, Games. When you look at the album, the album's tracks, you see the first 3 songs, Delta 2, Delta 4, and Delta 1, is sort of the individual pieces. And then if you turn the record over, the next 6 songs are sort of pieces to one overall thought. So it's a nice balance also of the direction of a couple songs and then also sort of a theme like a soundtrack. So it also has the best balance of that, individual tracks, and also like a running theme to the album. When I look into the tracks individually, first it starts off with Delta 2, which is probably the most progressive rock sounding song on this particular album. It does sound like an early role-playing game music, so if you're into like video games and stuff like that, I would think this, if people are into like 8-bit music and soundtrack music and also the history of video game music, I think they would really like Synergy Games. And it makes sense because it's called Games, and it's almost like a early electronic soundtrack for some unknown game. And the first track, Delta 2, definitely has that kind of RPG kind of game sound. Track 2, Delta 4, is one of my favorite on the albums. This one's a bit more eerie, a bit more dramatic. And that's the thing about Larry Fast music, especially as you go on. Like, Games is probably his best combination of sounds. Like, again, the early analog and digital sounds. Also one of his best because it's more of a soundtrack themed one, and then it has a couple songs. So it's probably the best, most cohesive album of his career. Sometimes Larry Fast's music can be a little bit over the top and be a little dramatic, and it's very synthesizer led, almost like as if he was a pianist, and he would do like the leads. Like sometimes it's a little bit dramatic and maybe a little bit over the top and a little bit too straightforward and not necessarily electronic music you can get lost in. So there is that part of maybe Larry Fast music that I don't like so much, but sometimes he can do a really good job of that. Like Metropolitan Suite has a few examples of that. But I think Games has one of his best examples of that in the track Delta 4. Delta 4 has some really good passages on it. It's a bit frantic, but it does have some depth and some lingering keyboards sounds in there. The ending's very lush sounding. One of his best ambient sort of passages in a song. This one has at Delta 4. In his entire career, I feel like has one of his most ambient pieces. There's a minute to a minute and a half in here that sounds like Michael Stearns or like Steve Roach. A little bit more meandering and just lush keyboard sounds. And so I really like this track specifically. But just the tones kind of morphing in here. Just a great ambient piece that's also tied to a little bit of a soundtrack music in here for sure. And then you have track 3, Delta 1. This one has a consistent beat in it, almost early like a proto-techno, or maybe it's a disco beat, but it sounds like Tangerine Dream, probably his most Tangerine Dream sounding like track he's probably ever done. The swirling keyboard is really nice, but it's one of his most elaborate tracks, and it's definitely a favorite on this album of mine. And then when you switch over to the second side, you have a 6-part series. It's basically Delta 3A through 3F. And this is a really nice overall balance of a soundtrack and a theme to, it's like some unknown movie, or maybe it's to some unknown game. And, the first part is a nice open. It kind of sounds like a theme song. It's pretty straightforward, not bad. Just kind of a preference thing for me with Synergy's music. Again, I when it comes to ambient music and soundtrack music, I tend to like it a little bit more in depth than sort of like a theme song sounding song. And this one definitely sounds like the opening, or so it is like a theme song, but still done very well. I don't have any track really under at least a 5 rating on this entire album. I think everything's over a pretty good range. And then you have the second part, which is part B. This one's a little bit more put together, good transition piece, a little bit more catchy than the first track, and so I like it a little bit better. And it's not catchy in a cheesy way; it's just catchy in a good way. And then you have part C, which is probably my favorite part of the album and my favorite part of this particular side for sure. Part C, perhaps the strangest or maybe darkest track on here, a little bit more mysterious, and I'm all up for that. That's right up my alley. I tend to like my electronic music when it comes to soundtrack music a little bit more spacey, and this is definitely in that range, and he's definitely leaning towards his more TV sound also in here as well. So it's a nice balance of a little bit more spacey, but a little bit balance of what he's going to get into. So it seems to have the best balance of his styles. And then you come towards the end of the album, track number 4, part D. This one's verging on sort of like the climax of the album, or the climax of the side. It has a little bit more of a dramatic, almost a horror movie sounding track, and you kind of get the feeling that he was really into or really inspired by Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield. I can hardly say that. Tubular Bells from Mike Oldfield. Definitely sort of has that sort of soundtrack feel, a little bit of a horror movie sound in here. It's a good song, but not really my style of electronic music. Maybe a little bit over the top for me, but still a little bit reserved and not as, I would say, cheesy, but cheesy in a good way, towards his later albums that would sort of come after this. And then you have Delta 3E. This one comes off that eeriness, and it's a little bit of a meandering track, but I like it a little bit better. It has a little bit more depth to it, a little bit more sparse, so I like this track a little bit better. And then it ends on a pretty good note in the final track, 3F, with a pretty good track as well. Kind of a nice ending. Wouldn't necessarily say it's a great conclusion of the album, but I think it's solid overall. And unlike Chords, I think this is even a more cohesive album overall. So I gave this one an additional 3 points for the overall of the album, and it lands at a 67 out of 100. So I think it's right on the high side of a good album. Probably the best Synergy album, as a whole. For me in particular, right with Chords. All right, so let's get a chance to check out the entire album called Games from Synergy from 1979. You'll see my scores above it, and then my overall score again of the album. Hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you on the next one.